So Tank Leonard, welcome to No Way Out.
Awesome. Great to be here. Thanks both to you, Moose, and Ponch for inviting me on.
So the three of us being Gen Xers, we've got a Top Gun naval aviator. We've got a Marine that grew up on Full Metal Jacket. We just have to know from the F-16 pilot right away. It was Iron Eagle, wasn't it?
All the way. In fact, my favorite thing, speaking of Iron Eagle, is that everybody still thinks that Top Gun is an Air Force movie. So the Navy's done more for Air Force recruitment than than you can believe.
Okay, yeah, all right.
No, it wasn't Iron Eagle, that's for sure. Although the when he puts the soundtrack in and blows up the enemy, that was pretty cool. But other than that, Top Gun beats Iron Eagle every day.
So you did not take an F-16 and bust your father out of a hostage situation.
No, that's right.
It's not based on reality.
Yep.
So good stuff. Well, we're glad you can join us, and we're really happy to have you here. We'll get right into it. I know Ponch is itching to ask you something, so hit it, Ponch.
Well, there's a common connection between Iron Eagle and the Navy, isn't there? There's Chappie, who played the drill instructor in An Officer and a Gentleman, right? Same person.
He's a Marine, yeah.
Right. But
and it was Lou Leonard, who was a Marine in who fought in Okinawa, who was a Marine aviator that fought in Okinawa. That was one of the first pilots in the Israeli Air Force that produced that movie.
Switch. I'm willing to take ownership of Top Gun, give Navy ownership of Iron Eagle any day.
Well, I think the point is that joint is something that we all learn very young in our careers, and we're showing a really good example of how it's supposed to work. We all get along, and we're going to have lots of fun things to talk about here.
Absolutely.
Why don't you give us the background of from a high level view? What was it that attracted you to fighter aviation, and why don't we start with that?
Yeah, Moose, thanks. I'll tell you, it really boils down to teamwork. I mean, I grew up playing sports in high school, loved being on a team, loved taking sort of individual talent, wiring it in parallel, going through tough practices, trying to outthink the enemy, and then executing on game day, and then learning, rinse, lather, repeat, across many different disciplines. And the mental, physical exertion, the camaraderie, the connectedness, that's really what I wanted. My dad was actually in the Army, so that kind of completes our full joint circle here. But
there you go.
He was an Army aviator, and I saw him, with his Army buddies, just a great family life. And so I wanted to go in the military for sure, but when it came down to what would I do in the Air Force, I went out and actually looked. There's a program called Operational Air Force out of the Air Force Academy where we got to visit an entire wing and all the different organizations on base. And I'll tell you, there's teams all over the Air Force, but I didn't see any team stronger than the fighter, community. And just, again, how we every day kind of gather together, think through problem sets, go out there and execute, debrief, and then take time to enjoy each other's companies and just build those relationships. And so that's what I wanted. And so once I saw that, boy, I was hooked. And then flying's fun too, and I've enjoyed that as well as leading airmen and the Joint Force, across all kinds of different situations. But really, to answer your question, it was all about teamwork.
When you were coming up, in selecting when you're senior at the academy, was fighter aviation the number one choice for pilots, or I want to fly C5s, or I want to fly
right. Yeah, I think, and cultures kind of ebb and flow. We're talking earlier about Top Gun and Iron Eagle. So, there's a lot of influence out there in the media for sure. But absolutely, I would say the majority of the people that wanted to go fly fighters. That was sort of the culture at the academy at the time. And a lot of people wanted to go do that. There is, I think, some other really strong cultures out there, too, inside the Air Force, our special ops community, and a couple others just to mention that. But yeah, fighter aviation, I think, was sort of at the top of the list. That's what most people were aiming for. And that's was really where the competition was and the camaraderie.
We live not far from Wright Pat, and that's my boys' favorite place to go. They've been going there since they were toddlers. And what an amazing museum to go in there. First of all, the place is, I know you've been there. The place is ginormous, but it's really cool how they set it up, how you really see how things have evolved all the way up to the planes that you've flown, starting with the original Wright Flyers and everything in between. It's such a great place to tell the story. And certainly things have changed quite a bit.
Oh yeah, it's going to that museum. I've been there several times, and it's actually interesting to see all the experimental planes. We tried flying saucers, we tried, all kinds of different designs. And back then they didn't have the advantage of digital technology modeling in sim, but if we thought something worked, we went out and tried it. And it's been pretty amazing the amount of learning we did and the adaptation to be able to get after aircraft that could go out there and do their purpose. And that museum is really a history book of all of that.
Speaking of museums, the aircraft that I flew in is the F-14, the iconic F-14 that everybody knows from the movie Top Gun. But the aircraft you flew in is the Viper, the F-16, and it's still being built, I believe, in one of the Carolinas, actually.
Yeah.
But there's a nice connection there back to John Boyd, right? And that connection belongs, or it really works with the YF-17, which is featured in the new movie Maverick, Top Gun, the F-18. So can you talk about the development of the F-16 and make some connections back to John Boyd?
Yeah, first of all, just, during that time frame, we were trying to figure out, what sort of design choices, we really wanted to make. And, you mentioned the F-14, which has a little bit higher wing loading, but a variable geometry. And so there's benefits to that. And then obviously each service kind of has their own sort of needs. Like, I just recently, flew the F-35, and to digress just a little bit, across the A, B, and C models, the Navy model has beefed up landing gear, et cetera. And obviously you've seen and done that piece. And so there were service specifics, integrated into that, as well as sort of historical specifics coming out of the Vietnam War. And the F-4, I think, was probably one of the historical, obviously iconic plane, if you will, F-105 as well, 106. And so, we were looking at what we learned in terms of the need for maneuverability. And I think where we were heading is for a higher wing loading, bigger type aircraft. And John Boyd, through his energy maneuverability theory, was able to reorient really the bureaucracy, which is, just phenomenal. That's a really hard thing to do. But through that theory, he was able to show kind of the cost benefit analysis of design trade-offs. And so now you have this low cost, lightweight fighter known as the F-16 gets selected way back when, and now is the most prolific fighter, really probably in history, at least modern history for sure. And we've been able to do tremendous things. You mentioned the production line in South Carolina. So they just rolled off the Block 70, Lockheed Martin did. And so, it's continued to be sold and modified and adapted, conformal wing tanks, better electronic countermeasures, all the systems have updated, on it. But yet it's still sort of that basic design that gives you, I think, an incredible amount of range, obviously incredible amount of maneuverability and agility and ability to maintain it as well. And so it ends up being just sort of this great trade-off that started from getting our overarching perspective right. And, that's kind of my one over the world. I know you guys know a lot more about Boyd's contributions, but what I really found is that he reoriented the bureaucracy's mindset using mathematics, using his background, and obviously influence and a lot of elbow grease. But by doing that, just opened the door to an incredible platform for sure.
Yeah, to your point, Tank, one of the things that he did was at Eglin Air Force Base, the lead designer of the F-111, which was something that Boyd was very much against, was at a bar. And I think Boyd called him out, but he was able to do so by specific things about, what the plane could do from a performance and weights and balance and everything. And he was very critical of things like the swing wing, whatever. And whoever I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head, but whoever he was, he became affected or influenced by Boyd to the point where he was involved on the F-16 project after that. I think he was the lead guy on the F-16 project too. But it was all with Boyd's kind of. He wasn't expecting a pilot to tell him all of the engineering points
right.
of the plane.
Well, yeah. I mean, you mentioned the F-111's influence as well, and there's sort of a follow-on story in history for the Air Force. So you mentioned kind of as I was coming on board choosing fighter aviation, the iconic plane at the time was the Strike Eagle in the Air Force. And it was interesting as we closed down the 111s, the EF-111s, and we sort of brought up the F-15E community. We took a lot of pilots. In fact, the majority of the pilots that went into that came from the 111 community. And so it grew up with a very air-to-ground focus. And once we started mixing in F-15C pilots and pilots from other backgrounds, we're able to get it to that multi-role fighter that it is today. Just phenomenal. But there's an interesting culture piece, right? There's the technology that allows you to adapt to different circumstances, but there's also sort of the people and the culture and sort of how you organize around the technology that's, I think, key as well.
Well, that's a big Boyd difference, right? People, ideas, things, not things, ideas, people.
Right.
Yeah. Tank, there's a story from Dan Peterson's book, and I want to share it with you. Maybe you've heard this, but it goes back to Eglin. I believe it was Eglin back in the early 70s. And there's a quote from Dan Peterson, and Dan Peterson is Captain Peterson, the founder of our weapons school in the U.S. Navy, which is known as Top Gun. But I'll read this phrase to you, and I'll kind of paint a picture for you. Because back then, John Boyd wasn't all about people, ideas, and things in that order. He was about things and ideas as far as the EM theory goes. So he said this to some Top Gun bros back then, and it was, "You cannot fight MiGs in an F-4. We'll lose wars that way." So he was very opinionated on how we can fight the air war in Vietnam with the technology that we had. But it goes on to say that one of the lieutenants that was from the U.S. Navy at this air-to-air conference pointed out that there's a problem with Boyd's EM theory. It excluded the skill, heart, and drive of the pilot in the cockpit, right? Yeah. So back then, we the Navy went with a different direction. We went with the really maximizing the use of the EM theory, and I think the Air Force stayed with the legacy Fluid 4, or I can't remember the name of the formation, but the Navy kind of split away from that and went towards combat spread, a defensive combat spread, what we have today. And, the outcome, and some can argue that, correlation is not causation. The U.S. Navy was able to increase the kill ratio significantly. I'm not going to go through the numbers because they vary from place to place. But I find that pretty remarkable that here we have a Air Force fighter pilot creating a theory that really is responsible for a lot of the design in today's fighter aircraft. But back then in the early 70s was focused on just the theory, the engineering, not the humanness, if you will. But that's changed over time. And I think what you and I went through when we went through flight training and experienced aviation, fighter aviation, is the people side of things. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I think what you guys have been showing, I think, through all these podcasts is that that's such a huge critical element. It's the human that reorients over and over again and kind of drives the machines or the tactics and techniques to be able to do that. We have a saying here in space that our most important weapon system lives and breathes. And so, you talk about people that are even further removed from their machines as, we fly, satellites out there on orbit. Very hard to understand what you're doing, what the enemy's doing in an environment like that. But yet it still comes back down to how people are trained, how they are equipped, and then how they think. What's their mindset? Do they have that warfighting mindset? Do they have agility of thought? Do they have the imagination not to get trapped by any preconceived notions or history, and to really absorb the information that they're getting and then be able to fight through that, both at the tactical, operational and strategic level. And so, I've come to find that out time and time again. And, really in the end, and I know we don't want to sort of simplify it too much because there's so much richness there with Boyd, but in the end, it's a 1v1 match. I mean, it's a wrestling match. I have a wrestling background. It's you versus a thinking opponent, and it's gritty. And, and so like if you remove that and don't really talk through the piece that's what warfighting is at its core, that you really miss the importance of the human in the loop and the ability to reorient and react and counteract. And in fact, in reality, we don't really want to compete. I think competition is kind of a trap. In other words, I don't want to do something that's just slightly better than my opponent, and then they do something that's slightly better than I do. I basically want to change the game so where they don't even know what game we're playing, and they just don't have any capability against me whatsoever. And so, that kind of thinking, that big kind of thinking, but that I think all originates back down in sort of the core mindset that you need to instill in people, and then give them the machines that can allow them to really get after it. I think, that's absolutely the right order to go in.
I don't think Boyd could have said that better himself, is that we want them to not understand what's going on so that they unravel and we emerge victorious. So staying on that point of 1v1, you're a graduate of Fighter Weapons School and also were an instructor there, just like Boyd, who spent years and years at Nellis Air Force Base, where you train the 1v1. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you learned as a student and then what you learned as an instructor and how it's informed your thinking around that sort of edge that somebody has in a 1v1 situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was able to go there as a student, like you said, and then come back as an instructor, and then as the 16th Weapons Squadron commander later on. So I don't know if I spent as long as Boyd did there, but I've had a couple laps around the flagpole. And really in the end, and this is what we used to say to all the students, this is a leadership school. And so, I mean, literally all the way back, 98 when I went through as a student, the instructor pilots even back then talked about this is a leadership school. Now, obviously you're going to get your doctorate in F-16 flying for sure. But they always pointed back to the bigger picture of we are teaching you to be a better officer. We are teaching you to be a better strategist. And then you're going to contribute as an F-16 pilot as well. And so kind of in between that senior officer leader and being a great F-16 fighter pilot was really the crux of what they were getting at. And that's how to be a great instructor. And so, they were focusing on, you obviously needed the skills, but you needed to be able to pass those skills to others. And I saw plenty of guys across my time there that were really good fighter pilots. I mean, they were outstanding, but they couldn't teach. And if they couldn't teach, they didn't get through the course, because if you can't pass along that information, you can't bring the whole team along. And so that was really the litmus test. And so that's the way it started. Day one, as I showed up for 98 Bravo, that was kind of, hit into us. We're obviously going to learn to be good, but if we can't instruct really well, the Air Force doesn't need us because we can't pass our information out to everybody. So again, with that as a backdrop, it was really interesting to see how things progressed across the course. And we ended up, learning about the F-16. We learned everything we could about everything that it did and all the components. And it was super in depth, which was great. But we real quickly went from there to how do we employ the F-16 alongside F-15C. So we'd get together and we'd do lots of offensive counter-air, defensive counter-air. We learned how to employ it with the A-10, in close air support scenarios. We learned how to employ it now with a multi-ship package with bombers and fighters, AWACS, and then even inside the F-16 community across air interdiction, surface, suppression of enemy air defenses. And so really quickly it became, how do you employ this, in much larger formations with a multitude of different aircraft capabilities. And then the scenarios just got harder and harder and harder. But so real quickly we learned it wasn't about just can I win in BFM. And so kind of Boyd's example of expanding that OODA loop, but still keeping that as your sort of core processor, now to be able to solve larger and larger problem sets with larger amounts of people was really key.
I mean, really elaborate on that, because that's unique. And I think a lot of people might be surprised that there's almost a very distributed leadership approach where you're expecting students at the youngest level of being pilots to become teachers that they can go in turn share with peers, and they learn how to evaluate each other. I mean, tell us more about how they, how they nurture that and how they throw gas on that, because that seems like a massive competitive edge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the weapons school and the weapons school model, both the Top Gun model and the Air Force Weapons School model, is distributed leadership. It's distributed instructorship and leadership, because they're teaching you. They want you to be able to go out, whether it's into the fleet or into the air wings, and be able to teach other people. And so you go back to your squadron and you're the chief instructor. And that's a very specific wording. You're not the chief or best fighter pilot. You're the chief instructor. And so you're working with the other instructors to up their game so that they could then, teach other people. And you're obviously teaching, the younger students yourself. But it's that distributed leadership model where they need you to go out and make other leaders and other instructors. And so right from the beginning, they're teaching you that in the class. And so, it was great as a student. We kind of didn't see it as much, but then as an instructor, we saw it in spades, where by the end of the course, you'd have a couple of lessons written down, and the student would just go and be checking all of them off and be offering instructional fixes, and even coming up with some things that maybe you hadn't even thought of before, and you're adding that to your toolkit. And they're doing that with all kinds of students from all kinds of different walks of life. And at the Air Force Academy, or not the Air Force Academy, the Weapons School, I mean, you have everything from all your fighter aircraft, all your mobility aircraft, you have intelligence, you have command and control, you have UAVs, you have special operations forces. And so, I mean, everybody wants to have a weapons school graduate. And so you're bringing together, I mean, really the whole Air Force in terms of at least the operational side. And so by the time you do that and learn from all your students and are instructing in that environment, you're incredibly equipped to be able to go out there and continue to do that. And so you might be in a squadron, but you're real quickly reaching out, trying to make those connections. And then definitely when you go off to combat, those relationships, multi-ship operations, but also multi-domain thinking is key. So it is distributed instructorship and leadership in spades for sure.
Tank, there's a very important feature of the OODA loop that I think we need to talk about that connects back to this idea of distributed leadership and improving the future, and that's the feedback loop. And at the weapons schools, we learn effective debriefing techniques. In fact, I'm very good friends with Kudro Teschner, who is the author of Debrief to Win. What I've learned through him is at the weapons school, he was the subject matter expert on that, on how to show others the art and science of debriefing. His book covers a lot of that. And then we learned recently that our MOTS course for the Marine Corps, they copy that as well. And then, but bottom line is it's how important is the debrief in improving performance, not just with an individual, but with a team. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I can't oversell how important it is. Obviously, you know that as well. We used to say you got to turn JP4 into knowledge, right? So you spend all this time, your crew chief goes out and get the plane ready. I mean, you're spending, millions of dollars on technology, fuel, I mean, you name it, right? And so to walk away from that without increased lessons learned, I mean, what a shame. And so we focus on the debrief, right? That's where you get everything, out of what you put into it. Same thing from a physical perspective, right? You go to the gym, but if you don't spend time rebuilding those muscles, all you do is break down your muscles. And so same kind of analogy here, but we started the debrief in the planning phase. It was so important, and we would teach our students that. And so as they're making planning choices, what tactic, they're going to do, what weapon selection versus target pairing, we're telling, hey, take notes. Like, you made this trade-off. Why did you make this trade-off right now? Because those are going to be good notes for later on. Same thing within, the brief. As you go through the brief, what did you feel like you covered well? What did you did not cover well? Is that going to result in, misexecution down the road? So take notes, like prep for the debrief. Execution-wise, you and I talked about this on a separate call. are you able to observe in detail about what's going on? That real time in the cockpit understanding of the fight is really important. Obviously, you're going to get a lot out of tapes, and when you watch other people and what they've done, or the playback of where everybody was, you don't necessarily have that data, but that real time, sort of almost feeling as you're observing the fight and listening to the fight, that's important too. And now you get in the debrief. And so how do you bring all that together, right? If you've prepped well and done all that, you have a ton of information. And what was happening was, like when I went through as a student, people would teach you how to debrief, but a lot of people had a lot of different techniques, and they all were good. But we needed a little bit more formalized and standardized way to do it. One, so we could efficiently and effectively not waste a lot of people's time, run out of sort of mental energy at the end of the day. So we needed to be able to do that. And then we needed a methodology really reinforced from educational standards, how people learn, and things like that. And so we kind of wrapped that all together. Cujo was a huge part of that. And we came up with a standardized way to do that, as well as standardized terms. And so things like, you walk into a debrief, you should already have some debrief focus points. So in other words, you're already trying to orient your learning to what you think is important. That doesn't mean you close your mind to that. Then you go out and you sort of gather facts based on those debrief focus points. And maybe you end up with another debrief focus point. Maybe you get different answers than you expected. And you go through that process and you try to figure out, okay, what are the root causes based on what happened? And then you want to offer instructional fixes and lessons learned, kind of wrap that all up. And so we had a very formalized way we did it. And then we had a very formalized, set of terminologies. And it really ended up great, because now you can take that format and you can walk into anybody's part of the weapons school, and everybody's going to go, hey, this is how we're going to go through it. So we're already mentally on the same sheet of music. We just have to fill that in with data, and we know what's kind of expected and coming next. And so all of that just, made our learning just so much more robust. And then it also gave, students, quite frankly, something to hang their hat on, because as you're learning, you really don't know. And
so I want to bounce an idea off you here, Tank, and this is something that connects back to your point about understanding the fight. And we could talk about situational awareness, having the bubble, and making sense of our environment. But when you go back to when you were a student and when I was a student, and we're going through that merge, we're setting up that perch fight, we come back to a debrief, and a lot of times we couldn't tell you which side we were on, where the sun was. We couldn't reconstruct anything. And the reason behind that is because we didn't know what to pay attention to, right? So the art of debriefing, I believe, helps us understand what to pay attention to the next time we see this. How do you see that, Tank? Is that about the same?
No, that's a really good way of kind of framing that. I hadn't really kind of thought about that. In some ways, I thought you were going, it helps us focus on the important information for what has happened. But what you said, what I heard you say was that actually helps us focus on the next time. And wow, I think that's super powerful. I would kind of say it's definitely both. Mm-hmm. It's not only looking back in terms of what's the most important information to focus on and learn, but what you added, I think, is super powerful, because it really is about getting better the next time. And so that sort of looking forward into the future piece, and then I think what you're doing is you're powerfully connecting that loop. In other words, we're looking back over what we decided and acted upon. Mm-hmm. And then now we're reorienting and we're starting that loop again, but we're doing so based on the information that just came out of the last cycle. And so, I think that's a super powerful way of looking at it.
So here's the killer question for all the business leaders and leaders of teams that are listening. Everything that you're describing, from distributed leadership, from peer feedback, from debriefing, what effect does that have on culture and cohesion? And do you think that those principles apply outside of an air wing?
Absolutely. I think they do. And I like culture and cohesion because, again, like I talked about, that's why I got into flying, was the teamwork piece. And so if you can have that in your organization where everybody has a shared understanding of the environment, they're thought of as a valuable part of the team, and now you're able to execute really well, and sort of that feels really good to be able to do that. And even when you lose, some of my best flights ever was when we just got, totally defeated by the enemy, but we learned a ton. And so, it's great to be able to do that. And I think the relationships that you build through kind of those ups and downs of learning and getting better is totally invaluable. And so kind of to your question though, business wise and so forth, this applies to everybody. I mean, I think you've said it before, if there's humans involved, boy, it applies. Mm-hmm. And if there's humans involved, we can think about the culture and connectivity piece and what we've learned from fighter aviation and apply it, into the business realm. And so I think individuals, I think it was Daniel Pink said it, they want autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so the ability to go, hey, here's your left and right limits, here's your planning factors, here's mission type orders. This is kind of guidance intent overall. And then you allow them the freedom, the freedom and the autonomy that's built from repetition and training to be able to go out there on the real playing field, whatever that looks like for you, whether it's, Sunday afternoon for an NFL player or, into a business negotiation from someone, in the business world or out into combat. Now they've had those reps and laps, the team's rehearsed really well, you've learned, and now you're out on the field and they're able to make those decisions and they understand the environment, and they have teammates around them that are working together. I think that's just super powerful, and people want that. And I just think as humans, we're built for community, and I think we enjoy winning too.
It seems like it also takes a lot of pressure. You as a general officer, right? Like it takes a lot of the pressure off when you know that the leadership is distributed, that your intent is being followed, that learning is occurring at all levels, back and forth, peer to peer, up and down. Everybody's learning from each other. It seems that that's one of the secrets of leadership that that a lot of people could take from this. That creating that kind of environment builds the culture and cohesion that your organization, your team is going to need to adapt in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment.
Yeah, it makes it a great place to work, in peacetime. And it certainly makes a great, you get your hand raised in combat, right? And so you win, and that feels good too, because losing definitely in that environment doesn't. But yeah, I think you're exactly right, Moose. As a leader, when I have a team or the privilege and honor to lead a team where folks are making decisions and they understand guidance and intent and they're moving out. And then also I would include myself in that process. Like, if I don't feel like we as an organization, to include myself, are learning and reorienting, I get really suspicious and I get really nervous, because for me, that's always been, hey, we're missing on something, or we're not putting as much energy into it as we should. I read a lot about Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, and I think he's one of the greatest exemplars of a guy that would go out there and rehearse his team. There's stories of him moving a bunch of dirt, for a ginormous sandbox. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and he did it with Legos. That's another great story. And, he basically built relationships with other people. He went out there, rehearsed concepts, and people were, understood the plan, and he was able to move out. And another great thing I like, just as an ad about then Secretary Mattis, we got to spend some time with him. And he told us a story about when he was out at the National Training Center, and that he could tell which teams, which units that came out there would succeed or fail. And he said the attribute that really was the deciding factor was, no kidding, that they had affection for each other. Now, I almost fell over when I had a Marine 4-star, now Secretary of Defense, tell me about affection. That was probably the last word I thought would come out of his mouth. But I can't think of a better word. And he's obviously the warrior monk, and he had a lot of stories to back it up. But it was really neat, because that affection, he went on to describe, was really sort of the lubricant that allowed everybody to be able to press each other, to be able to trust each other, to be able to learn from each other, and then to do it again and again and again in the face of a thinking enemy. And so just phenomenal leader and a lot of really great lessons learned.
I'll tell you from a cultural standpoint, just because you brought it up, the Marines, I mean, I've been off active duty for a long time, and I still get mentorship from my peers, my former commanders, my subordinate Marines. We still take that with us everywhere where we go. That's the kind of, back to the topic of, culture and cohesion, because that environment was built like that, to learn from each other, to have, as Mattis said, the affection for each other. It doesn't fade. I'm going on Thursday to see one of my roommates from the basic school get promoted again. So it's like we continue that, but he's learning from me. I'm learning from him. We're learning from each other. That's how it perpetuates. And I think that no company is exempt from that. No organization is exempt from that. No team is exempt from that. Anybody can do it, because the principles are pretty simple when the culture's in place.
Absolutely.
Hey, General, there's a story I want to bring up from General Mattis I think is very important, and it's going to connect back to your and my time back at Air Command and Staff College, and I think when you were at SAS. We were learning a lot about effects-based operations back then, value-focused thinking, that type of approach. To me, it worked quite well in an Air and Space Operations Center, strat to task, matching weapons to targets and things like that. It worked well, but it didn't work at the strategic level of warfare, if you will. And I think General Mattis, he got rid of that when he was over here in Norfolk. I forgot which command he had over here, but he recognized that we can't apply that like peanut butter spread across everything. You just can't use effects-based operations. And today, many organizations are using value-focused thinking, which is loosely connected to effects-based operations, to try to apply that same approach in their organizations. And we warn them about it as it's contextual, right? So even though you and I learned about it, and all our brothers and sisters learned about it almost 20 years ago, geez, it's horrible. It doesn't mean it applies everywhere. It has bounded applicability, and I think the general saw that. So his ability to reorient, not just him, but the whole force, is phenomenal. Now, question to you: are you using EBO in space, or what are you using now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just a little bit of sort of my journey through effects-based. I actually wrote a paper on it at ACSC. And so, but you're exactly right. When you have the capability to do more or better sort of causal linkages, like if I drop a bomb on, 2 feet of concrete and, at this angle, whatever, you can model that pretty well. That's, very known science. And, if I don't want to drop a bomb on the building, I know that I can send, SEAL team X, Y, or Z in there to zip tie everybody. That's also very effectual. And, given their track record, they'll probably have a 90% or even higher, chance of doing that. So you're exactly right. But when it comes to, a VUCA, volatile, uncertain, type environment and humans, and you mentioned at the strategic level, you just can't, get down to that deterministic level of thinking. And so it's great here in Space Command because we really focused on that. We call it Space Command 2.0. In other words, Space Command was stood up. It was stood back down after 9/11 when we stood up NORAD Northcom, because at that time the law only allowed us to have 9 combatant commands. But now that we've branched out, stood up Cybercom and Space Command, what we're really looking at is no one's ever fought a war in space. And so, we have historical lessons from warfare. We have an understanding of the space environment and, the astrophysics that go into that environment. And so we do have some understanding, but it's peripheral understanding. And so, even taking air doctrine or land doctrine or naval doctrine and saying, yeah, space is like, a great big ocean, or space is like this. Those things aren't for certain. And so from the beginning, we really tried to make sure that we had a really divergent, and what I mean by divergent is that we're considering other possibilities and not just doing one-for-ones between domains. And so we actually stood up a strategic initiatives group here in the command, and we tried to bring in some design thinkers, and we actually try to design that into our planning process, where we kind of start off the process really focusing on what is the problem we're trying to face, and what are some other ways of thinking through this problem before we got into sort of the more deterministic planning. And so I think the newness of the command has allowed us to bring on, that culture, and by all means, it's not fully grown out. We're definitely kind of building and growing that mindset. I think it's a little bit counter from what the historical military process has been, sort of more on the deterministic side. So I think we're fighting a little bit against human tendencies and military culture historically, but we're fighting that fight, which I think is really good. And so we have the newness of the command to try to build that culture, but then we also have the newness of the domain. And so I think that's been very powerful. And so that's the way we're kind of trying to approach it, is build that, sort of doubt, maybe. I'm not sure how to actually capture it, but lack of certainty and lack of, cause and effect, that obviously effects-based operations allows you to consider multiple avenues of cause and effect, which allows you to do targeting, as you just brought up, from sort of a more holistic perspective. But how do you back that up a little bit and then actually bring in different things at the strategic or problem framing piece of planning, and really considering the multitude of options at that level, which, you could say that's what that's the goodness of effects-based operations, that you just consider more than sort of the bomb on target solution. But at the strategic level, I think the way you do that is you approach your problem sets from just, hey, I'm not sure exactly how this is going to play out. I have some other examples. They could inform it, but hey, what's the counterintuitive? And then take that counterintuitive and what's something else that could happen? What's the complete opposite of that? And really trying to do that future framing. Yeah. And so how we're handling that, we're trying to put that into our process and teach that as well. And again, we're not at sort of 100% success, but we are growing in that area.
Could you do us a favor and talk about being a general officer? And I'm going to anchor you a little bit.
Okay.
You don't have all the answers, right?
Nope.
Okay. So many leaders today believe they have the answer and that their teams must just do what and how they tell them to do it, right? Can you walk us through that type of thinking, or the type of thinking that we should have our organizational leaders thinking about as far as having the team?
Right. So I think anybody can get trapped in that, even general officers, well, probably mostly general officers get trapped, or, people that are of higher ranking, because, we do get the ultimate decision, yes or no. And we have seen a lot. And so I think you and I have talked a little bit about the apprentice leadership model, right? So you really, if you're going to do something, you really want someone that has experience to kind of talk through that. And so that's valuable, but you can't overvalue that experience, particularly in a VUCA world, right? So that's really the point. It's almost back to your effects-based operations point. Experience and cause and effect and things that you've seen before, those all are valuable pieces, but those aren't the most valuable pieces. And so really what you need to do is utilize the diversity of the team and diversity of thought to be able to do that. And so you have to bring people along and develop them to be able to do that. And then you have to have processes in place, because you could have the most diverse, empowered team, and if you come into a meeting and you're sitting at the head of the table and you're like, I really like option A. And then any questions, any comments, you're going to get, yes, sir, I like option A as well. And, you might get one courageous soul to go, sir, I like option A, but, and we'll offer something that's not really meaningful. So I think it's really important to foster that culture of where you're approaching the problem set together. And as a leader, I think our responsibility, obviously that culture where you're speaking last, I think Simon Sinek talks about that, if I get the author right. Don't speak first, try to speak last, ask a lot of questions. I feel like as a leader, really as a person, if I can ask better and better questions each day, I'm improving as a leader for sure. And then I think as a leader, it's also important because everybody's trying to imagine the future, right? History is actually hard enough to get agreement on. The future is even harder. And so how do you take your team through visioning the future? And actually, are you teaching people to do that? And so on the apprenticeship sort of, I think the first thing in apprenticeship, and I feel like, as a leader, I need to be a part of helping someone through an apprenticeship, which I think for me, first of all, means I need to model the right behavior. And so I'm thinking through the future. I'm speaking it out loud, even though I might be wrong. I'm not ashamed to do that. I'm very clear on my assumptions. And then I talk about how I made sort of the decision or why I think this future is going to turn out this way. And so I'm very transparent with my thinking. And then I think the next step in sort of apprentice leadership is scaling. And so that means I'm going from what I would call above the waterline events. So, hey, the holiday party, I'm thinking about this and why would that be a good venue? So I'm thinking aloud about things that don't matter much. And then I scale it to more complex, more important problem sets. And then the third part about apprenticeship is I actually fade out. In other words, I'm not the guy maybe at the head of the table, or I don't open up the meeting. I don't speak first. I really wait and I really force other people to have ideas and bring their best to the table. And I'm taking myself out of the problem. I'm maybe not showing up at all the planning events. I'm not having as many IPRs.
So Tank, we want to build on this some more.
Okay.
And I think Moose is grabbing a document. I don't know if he has it yet, but we talked to Chet Richards recently, and the individual OODA loop is going to be a little bit different than a team OODA loop. And there's an acronym that Boyd used for the team or organization, and it's right in front of you. And I think Mark or Moose, could you go ahead and read some of those off? I can't see them.
Yeah. So IOHAI was insight, orientation, harmony, agility, and initiative. And insight was the ability to peer into and discern the inner nature and workings of things. Orientation, of course, the second part of OODA, right, is the many-sided cross-reference, implicit cross-referencing process that involves mental images and impressions of the phenomena that we're all interacting with and dealing with. Harmony is the web of interconnecting feelings, thoughts, values, action among otherwise differently oriented individuals that permit them to operate and cooperate in a focused way. And then agility, the ability to shift from one unfolding OODA loop pattern to another by being able to transition from one orientation to another. And then the last one was initiative, the internal drive to think and take action without being urged.
Yeah. So this is what you described, I believe, in the last few minutes. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think it's more well said here with Boyd than what I was rambling on. But yeah, that's pretty powerful. This is the first time I've ever seen that. So I really appreciate you guys letting me in on this. That's really neat.
No, and Chet pointed out recently that, we can't take the genetic heritage approach to a group. We can't apply it across the board. So we need a different type of orientation for a group or a team, right? And that's what this is. And we need to explore this more. But what you were talking about a few moments ago, I just, wanted to let Mark bring this up and go, hey, this is what it looks like in a group OODA loop from the orientation standpoint.
Yeah, I love that. It's, interesting to me, and I'd love to unpack, why did he choose insight over observation, and one of my maybe guesses at that, obviously you guys know more than I do about this, but kind of my first thoughts are, observation, that's an individual sort of collecting data, but insight is sort of the collection of all those observations kind of prior to reorienting, in Space Command. We've kind of moved away really in the whole space enterprise from space situational awareness, which is data, where are satellites, to space domain awareness, which is what is the enemy's intention for those satellites, or why are they building out into this orbit? And then the other thing that sort of strikes me is harmony, which I think you want to arrive at harmony. I love that sort of collective tapestry of people and thinking, but I also love disharmony. I tried not to make a decision without having somebody adamantly disagree, because otherwise I think we might be missing something. So I don't know if I would sort of, or maybe he includes sort of the harmony, disharmony, or the process of getting and analyzing disharmony to get to harmony, but the right harmony. if you will. So those are kind of my reflections on this.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I would. So let's stick on disharmony for a second. So, as a general officer and you're in command, and you have a lot of people around you that have varying opinions, how do you ensure that the respectful learning disharmony that you need to hear? How do you promote a culture that wouldn't prevent somebody from saying, I know what the answer is, I don't want to say it, or I want to bring this up, but I don't want to say it? How do you create that environment?
Yeah, I think moves kind of on three different levels. At the tactical level, as an individual and how you relate to other people, I think it's body language, it's listening, more than talking, and then not chopping people's legs out from underneath them for whatever the reason is, or no matter how much stress you have. And so just being someone that they feel safe around and is curious, and they understand that you value curiosity and dissenting opinions, and that you value people. So that's at the tactical level. At the operational level, I would say you have to have a process of doing that. In other words, some people create red teams, some people appoint people to talk about the other side's point of view. I like doing a pre-mortem. That's something I learned throughout my growing up is literally not asking, what do you think about this decision? It's, how will this decision fail? It's like a positive question, but in the negative. And so, hey, let's talk about how this decision's going to fail. And when you actually make that the question, now people are like, well, the general wants answers on how this is going to fail, so I'm going to give them an answer. And I wouldn't say they get tricked, but you sort of open up the gates to get their dissenting opinion, but it's done under the blanket of, hey, I'd like to hear this from you. And then I think at the strategic level, I think it's really important to understand history and have examples of, where you just didn't get it quite right, and people didn't speak up. The tragic accidents with the space shuttle. There's some really good case studies that really strike your heart, because there were humans' lives lost, and it was super tragic. But to go through that with your team, I think kind of builds that mindset. And at the strategic level, I think you need to operate with that as sort of top cover. And like I said, bring it all the way back down to how you interact with people. And so that's kind of my approach into making sure that people bring the, hey, that's not a good idea, or, hey, I just thought of this, and that people feel safe to do that.
Yeah, it's important to have those assumptions challenged, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah. And then you can't challenge assumptions unless you get your assumptions out there. And so, kind of a line of questioning that I like to use is, we're discussing something, why do you think that? What are the facts and data, that led you to believe that? Why do you prefer that option? And trying to, not in a condescending way or not in a sort of an attacking way, but really trying to tease out what's behind that person's perspective and position, really then leads to, wow, okay, we have different perspectives. So the team recognizing that, and then, go back to military planning, turn your assumptions into facts if you can. At least get them out on the table, though, because otherwise you're not going to make a good decision.
I use the quote a lot that they attribute it to either Mark Twain or Will Rogers, but it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you're absolutely positive is true, which turns out not to be true.
Not to be true. Yeah.
And if it's not challenged, sometimes unfortunately you see in the business world where rank and position also means that I'm right every time I speak, and a lot of leaders don't have they don't create the environment where challenge is acceptable, where it's psychologically safe to do so, even bringing up, even if and then, we come from a culture from, between the Marines and Naval Air and Air Force, Fighter Aviation, you're a brand new lieutenant and you see something wrong and you didn't tell the colonel, and he got behind the stick of a plane and died because you didn't say anything. That's on you. That's a failure of that's a failure of leadership, and we're taught that from a very early age in our military careers. And I think that's a principle that can easily be translated to a non-military environment, that when people have insights and inputs, they should be able to share them. We should be able to gather as many perspectives as possible with rank and emotion outside of the door in order to learn effectively. And then what we're talking about earlier, to reinforce the culture and the cohesion of our team, of our organization.
Yeah. I was reading Ray Dalio's Principles, and he talks about his organization in there where they have baseball cards, and if they're talking about a certain type of decision, they get the best people who have made the right decision, in the past. And there's a little bit of sort of maybe looking back, doesn't necessarily predict the future, but I find it very interesting from a merit-based system that, they're looking at your track record. And in fighter aviation, the guy that was best at BFM, the guy or the gal was best at BFM, everybody would go to that instructor to try to learn how to do BFM. And so expertise and, historical good decisions were sort of the merit-based system. And regardless of rank or how old you were or whatever, you were looked, to contribute, and your perspective was valued. And so I think that's a powerful piece that definitely can, span across, all situations, business, military, et cetera.
So Tank, I want to start to bring this home a little bit. And that is one of the questions I have for you is, as a general officer, are you seeing a lot of effective debriefing happening today? And then the second question would be, why is debriefing so hard to do? Why aren't more leaders doing this outside of the military?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I think humanly debrief is hard because, in the middle of the debrief, they're going to show your tape. And I think you've been there probably, maybe not as much as I, but, you see a total failure, right? And it's really hard to be exposed like that. I think just humanly, that's really tough. And so unless you're raised like we were, as we were O1s and, and above, that was the culture, that was the expectation. So I think it's humanly really hard. And, no one wants to be seen as a failure. And it's also very time consuming. I'm sure, I know both in the Air Force, Navy, Marines, et cetera, the debrief in some cases, you're talking about 2 hours minimum, like for the simplest, of activity. And so, you get into a larger multi-ship kind of phase, and that debrief could go on forever because there is so much to learn. So I think it's time consuming. I think it's humanly hard to be able to do that. And quite frankly, I don't think that we spend, the amount of time also teaching people how to debrief. I mean, I just went through what we have, at the Weapons School. Cujo's written his book. There's been some other, papers that are done out there. But I'm not trained to do that other than how I was trained to do that in, my flying career. And so I think that we need to educate folks, and we need to do that also in our training from the very beginning. It'd be very interesting, I think, if you went to basic training, or even my son just graduated from the Air Force Academy. And what if you went through training sessions and then, you're the student, right? You might be the new dually at the Air Force Academy. Do you call it sort of timeout and then debrief, right? That event. Like we would do that with our students at the Weapons School. And so, why wouldn't you do that with new trainees and teach them not only how to debrief, but then also teach them the value of the debrief? And so, in my opinion, I think we need to begin very early on in the military and inculcate that into our very initial training and accession sources. And I think that will help us sort of downrange in the end product. And then you just have to dogmatically spend time to do that. So really what I think ends up happening is we're not trained to do that. It's really hard. And then spending the time on that is really hard because we're just off to sort of the next thing, if you will. So I think it's a full spectrum change if you want to be able to get to really debriefing well.
All right. Next question, F-16 or F-35?
F-35. And I hate to say that because, the F-16's my first love, and I understand every inch of that plane, and, I can flip any switch with my eyes closed. But I'll tell you the F-35. So in the F-16, I used to spend a ton of time trying to put together information and really kind of fuse it into a holistic picture. In the F-35, I spend my time trying to give that to other people. And it's a very easy plane to fly. It's a very hard plane to operate as a mission system, not just a weapon system, just because it's so capable. But phenomenal aircraft. The other part about it that a lot of people don't know that I got to see when I was the wing commander at Luke was it is very maintainable. You might have heard stories of, the low observable coating on like the B-2 or the F-22 requires, specific hangars. I mean, this is the crew chief out there with some LO putty, and I'm obviously making it more simple than it is, but it is very easy to maintain. It's its own engine test bed. You don't need to have a hush house to run the engine. It does engine diagnostics after you do an engine change. So when you're talking about what we're looking to do with agile combat employment, you can put this thing down, on a runway in the middle of the jungle and maintain it at its 5th gen state very easily. And so I think that's another incredible piece of the airplane. It's not only operationally is it super capable. And then one last F-35 plug is, and this is really important. So we, like the F-16 grew into an international fighter. The F-35 started off as the Joint Strike Fighter and Coalition Strike Fighter. And so when I was at Luke, we were training Australians, Israelis, South Koreans, Norwegians, and I forgot a bunch of them, but we were training a whole coalition. And oh, by the way, we had a Marine guy that we put through that we sent up to the weapons school to sort of start tying together MOTS. And then as the F-35C came on board, we did the same thing with Navy pilots. And so, the Navy's, and again, I'm simplifying this just based on classification, but the Navy's, F-35 is going to talk to the Aegis cruiser, and they're going to figure that piece out. They probably have already. And so by sort of relation, we're going to now, because the Air Force flies an F-35, be able to tie into an Aegis cruiser. And again, I'm just offering that as an analogy. But what I'm saying is this thing was born joint, born coalition, and training together. I mean, I'd fly an Australian jet, against a Norwegian in a U.S. jet. We shared maintenance, we shared aircraft. And so you're talking a phenomenal fighting force that the F-35 brings, as well as just its sort of individual platform capability.
So you highlighted the importance of information flow between the generation of aircraft, right? You didn't say much about the what was it like to fly it? You talked about the information flow, and that's surprising. Most people don't talk about that.
Well, we used to joke. Yeah, we used to say, like F-16 as an example, not picking on it, but, you buy an aircraft and you get free software. Now we buy software and we get a free aircraft. So I was in there when we transitioned one of the block tapes in the F-35, and it went from, this is a really awesome airplane to this was an incredible airplane. We just changed the software. We didn't change out any parts, any hardware whatsoever. And we got like 4-fold capability, like in 30 minutes when, it probably was a little bit longer than that to upload the tape, but literally, just overnight. And so the software integration, just incredible. And you're right, it's about information flow. It is a pretty sweet dogfight machine, although it doesn't have the sustained rate that the F-16 does. So you can get land shark if you try to fight an old fight like that.
I was going to say, F-35, A, B, or C.
Yeah.
That's a good Marine question.
The C's a little bit heavier and not as much gas. The B doesn't have a gun, onboard gun. You can carry gun pods. And so obviously I'm biased, but I like the A a lot.
It's all good. I guess it's all the same. We're all on the same team, I guess, when it's all.
Yeah. Well, the B's pretty cool. I mean, to be able to take off and land, straight up and down. You can fly all versions in the simulators that we had. And so, I'd go up there and load up a B model and practice landing on an amphib. And, I haven't been trained as a Harrier pilot and VSTOL and all that stuff, but it's so simple and easily mech'd. that, you know, you can put it right down on the middle of an amphib with no training whatsoever. Pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, it's really interesting as a, you know, I was an artillery guy, but to see that the VMAs, you know, the fixed wing marine attack squadrons, they're now redesignated VMFA. So they're back to fighter. So it's back to fixed wing fighter attack. So it's neat to see that capability as part of the MU. It's really, really something. And they are, I mean, it's really cool to watch. You know, I always thought Harriers were cool. Loud, and you see a lot of black smoke come out. And,
right.
But looks really cool.
So on the topic of capability, are you concerned at all with automation reducing human capability with these fifth generation fighters? And let's move that on to space and what we're doing elsewhere with AI and machine learning. Any concerns there?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I would say, again, it's sort of a mixed bag. It depends on kind of how you're looking at it. So as an example, the F-35 has great speed control and angle of attack control to where, you know, you can land it hands off. I mean, you just point the thing where you want to hit and it'll basically land itself, rotate, put out the speed brakes, slow down. Awesome. So our young lieutenants, when we first, these are 01, 02 lieutenants in the Air Force, they would, when we did our first class, you know, so these are young guys right out of initial pilot training. And one of them had an autopilot problem coming back and he had a hard time landing it himself. And he was just so used to the automation. So we realized that obviously he got, you know, safely on the deck. That's the rest of the story. But we basically had to put him through practice, you know, in the simulator. And then also we sort of decided that, hey, until you've soloed, you can't land this thing with the automation. And then later on, you have to have, you know, you have to do it yourself every so often. And so there is some of that, right? When the automation fails you and it's not always perfect, it's a machine, you know, if you don't have the skills to do it. And so you got to be real careful about that. On the flip side, the amount of, and it's, I don't know if I'd call it automation quite yet, but definitely the integration of information and displays and so forth. But yeah, the automation of the plane practically flying itself at the exact knot and altitude and foot and angle of attack that you tell it to fly at while you're working all your other mission systems is just incredible. And so, you know, it's flying you up, or it's freeing you up from some of those other flying tasks to be able to do mission tasks. And then it makes the mission tasks just that much easier with how the systems are mech'd. And so super impressive from that piece. I would tell you though, Ponch, to maybe answer a larger question is on automation, you know, whether it's AI, ML or sort of whatever level of sort of human machine teaming that you're at, you know, I just wonder, why don't we just use sort of the same process that we use with just humans, which is, hey, we start off taking baby steps. We put it through tests, you know, in the simulator or sort of above the waterline type events. And then we train it, we certify it, we inspect it, and we monitor it, and then we command and control it. And so, you know, that's the way I look at it is how do we do that, you know, across the board? And if you have a machine in there, same thing. You got to, you know, all the machine learning, like what is the data set we're using? If it's not a diverse data set, then we could corrupt sort of the decisions and the training that a machine learning or a computer or algorithm has. And so, you know, just like if we only gave, you know, a new lieutenant a certain task, they're going to be good at that, but maybe not good at others, or maybe not good, to Moose's point earlier, on, you know, understanding how to work in a team or understanding how to, you know, think agilely. And so I think as long as we sort of take whatever mixture of human and machine and we put it through some really tried and true processes and monitor it, and then, you know, and then put the right level of authority and automation, you know, based on ROE, risk, et cetera, I don't think it's as scary as maybe some people make it out to be.
I got a question for you, Tank, about, you know, a lot of people that tune into this in various businesses, they maybe oversee or lead divisions that have different cultures, right? Like they have they make widget A over here, and in another part of the country or the world, they make widget B, or they do something completely different, or maybe it's a holding company and they have, different companies with different cultures. You're in a leadership role in the Joint Command. And for civilians that don't know much about Joint Commands, I mean, it's a fusion of all of the branches of the military. And now we have, some recent addition of Space Force. As an Air Force officer and as a general officer, what have been some of your strategies of leadership when you're fusing and combining people from different cultures and different backgrounds? Because, companies work with partners at different firms. What are some of the things that you've learned?
Yeah.
When you have that kind of differentiated cultures and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Moose, that's a really good point, because as the chief of staff, since the beginning of Space Command, that's one of the problems we ran into, and so we were building out the command starting in August of 2019 and throwing people at the fire as fast as we can. And it was interesting as some different services came together with different backgrounds and different terminologies and different expectations. We ran into a lot of issues, just interpersonal issues, and our teams in some cases weren't as functional as they could be. And, we real quickly noticed that. And then what we did very quickly was, as we onboarded people, we did, certain things just very simply. We had an inter-service panel. And then we added to that inter-service panel civilians. And then we added our contract responsible officer to talk through the nuances of contractors, because we had a lot of contractors, because you could pay for that manpower, faster than you could PCS a lot of people in. And so I think, one of the big lessons learned is to start off with a familiarization and understanding of, if you do have different tribes across your business. And so in the military, we have services. In a business, you probably have people that grew up maybe more on the HR side, or more on the ops side, or more on the marketing side, or more on the business development side, more on the accounting side. And so, and then maybe you have, and we do too, people from, different eras. You mentioned Gen X and millennials and so forth. And so I think just an understanding. So first of all, just quite frankly, talking through the characteristics without putting, definitive labels. And so that's one of the things we talked through in our inter-service culture. I grew up as an Army brat, but I've spent 30 years in the Air Force. And I've spent a lot of time around Guardians now that I've been in Space Command. And so anyways, we all have sort of a mixed bag. And so that's my next point, is not only educate and bring out examples and open communication, but then also when you go through that and you build that sort of common understanding, really the next step is to recognize people, though, as individuals. And so not just to label them like, oh, you're an Air Force guy, so, you like effects-based operations and you love your F-16 and technology, going back to maybe car builder and the Masks of War, like each service has their own characteristics. But really what I like to say is to actually get to know the person deeper than their uniform, deeper than sort of the accoutrements we wear, whether it's a suit or whether it's camouflage or whatever. So I think that's really important. And then the last thing I'd offer, there's real little easy things to do. So as like the chief of staff, when I did my staff meetings, I actually created the side template because I had decision authority to do that. And the very first bullet, as each staff section reported out, was a thank you. And I put it on there. I put thank yous. And I expected someone to fill it out and talk about it. And the idea was they were supposed to say thank you to someone not in their division or branch or whatever. And so it just brought this, sort of sense of gratitude and recognizing the strengths of each other and that we're a team and we depended on each other. And so, kind of my third point would be there's a lot of just little things that you do every day that can help you build past that. So recognizing it, educate it, make sure that you get to know people as people and you don't get so trapped in your labels as you're trying to educate people on them. And then there's a lot of just real little things, consistency over time, where you can overcome those things. And then you just got to repeat, because, at least in the military, you have people coming in and out, every 2 years or shorter for the military. And then, sometimes on the civilian side, definitely on the contractor side as well. So that's kind of what I would offer in a nutshell.
Do you ever observe any interesting learning, like, coming from a very unique culture in the military, the Marines? Do you see cross-pollination of ideas and traditions that people become more open to or aware of as they learn? Do you start to see people waking up at 04 with the Marines, going out and PT and doing pull-ups, or what?
Well, yeah, and that's a great point, because all of that I just mentioned, if you can get away from work and get away from, and get into other environments, physical fitness, playing sports, taking some time on Friday, just to, go to the officers club, enlisted club, and just spend some time with each other. We took our joint directors, we did an escape room, we hiked up Pikes Peak, just ways that we can, build a familiarity with each other outside of work. And then if you ever can get everybody to suffer together, that's even the best part. So
that builds cohesion and culture.
We did Murph back in the day, if you're familiar with that CrossFit workout, that's a lot of suffering. So like that builds a lot of camaraderie and breaks down a lot of barriers for sure.
Well, I imagine too, if somebody, a Marine or a sailor, comes up and asks you where the head is, you know how to direct them to the proper place.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that's another great point, right? So, we were on an Air Force base, now Space Force base. We have Department of the Air Force civilians, because our Combat Command servicing agent right now is the Air Force. And so we had a lot of Air Force roots. And I encourage people not to use Air Force jargon, to try to use joint jargon, or if there isn't sort of a joint term, to actually use kind of the full gamut of service terms, if you will, And so, yeah, the head, the deck, third deck, fourth deck, whatever. We gave out, you guys from the maritime community will love this. We had a plank owner award. We took it from the Navy, where if you were the first crew on a ship, you were a plank holder, I think is what the Navy calls it. And so we actually have, for all the original members in Space Command that have served for the first time in each one of our manning positions, you get a plank. And we talk about Navy culture and why that was so important, because the culture that grew up on that ship is super sticky. And I've talked to a lot of, old retired Navy guys, and they're like, yeah, the USS such and such, she was always like that. And it's true, I think, in other organizations. It sounds like it's super true on ships. Maybe we can talk about more of that later. But my point is, we used, terminology, we used traditions, we celebrated each other's birthdays en masse. The Air Force element just didn't go celebrate the Air Force birthday. We all celebrated together, things like that. But yeah,
you know what November 10th is, right? The 10th of November, you know what to do, right?
Yeah, well, so one of my sons is born on November 10th.
There you go.
And I have a daughter born on October 13th.
Oh, and so you got the naval services covered then.
Yeah. So what I first do on those days is celebrate my kid's birthday, and then call up my favorite, sailor or Marine and congratulate them on their birthdays.
Well, well, I know now. It's interesting. So I don't know the date, but I know it's 1947, and the plane that the order was signed is here at Wright Pat, where the Air Force was born. They say it was born inside this airplane.
Yes. Yeah, that's where it was signed out. Yeah, it's a pretty neat, museum within a museum.
It's it's a phenomenal spot. Well, no, I mean, I think you hit people, ideas, things. You nailed it there with a very good, and it's interesting to see too how a new culture emerges when people get together and they can share and learn from each other, and it makes them
that's the Space Command culture. I know the Guardians in the Space Force really focus on creating a warfighting culture, and it's been neat to walk through that path with them, particularly because they're in our department, the Air Force department. So as an Air Force and a Space Force team now, it's been neat to kind of see them grow and walk, along that with them. So I'm super excited as they grow their culture as well, because space, I mean, it's incredibly ubiquitous. We need the timing signal to, use our credit cards at the gas pump. I have what I call my space Jeep. In other words, I look at space delivered weather to figure out if I'm going to take the top off or not. I have, space delivered music, even when I'm out on those trails. I have space, navigation through the GPS. And so it affects, in all seriousness, it affects every walk of our life. And it definitely that way in the military. And so it's been neat to see how joint space is and how we need to be a team. And I would tell you, what's going on the commercial sector and the civil sector too. This is a calling for joint interagency, commercial and civil approach to space. And here in Space Command at Echelon, we're trying to build those teams.
Well, hopefully with the Marines there, the aggregate PT score is increased.
Yeah, well, we got Marine space officers now.
Awesome.
So.
And you have a Marine senior enlisted advisor in Space
Master
Command.
Gun Stalker, I'll tell you, phenomenal individual. And just a great example of what the Marine Corps produces in terms of leaders, and then just a phenomenal part of our joint team. Yep. And so that's super exciting as well.
I got to tell you, back to the topic of Gen X, though, when you were a kid, you thought in 2023, if we had a Space Force and Space Command, I never thought he'd be wearing camouflage. For those that are listening, you got your camouflage utilities on. I thought there'd be some kind of helmet and some badges, Captain Kirk.
Well, see, I'm still in the Air Force. This is Spice Brown. So
That's true.
Yep. The Guardians, they grabbed the blue. Although I think if we sort of had to redo it from scratch, we'd probably give Army black, Air Force would take blue. Actually, Space Force would take black, correction. I think maybe the Army would take Spice Brown and the Air Force would take blue. So we're a little rearranged, but I think we're doing all right.
There you go. Well, as I didn't realize that we had in common too. I'm the son of a career Army officer as well. I'm also the black sheep of my family. So
that's right. That's super exciting.
Awesome, Tank. We really appreciate you coming on No Way Out and bringing it home with a perfect description of culture, of people, ideas, and things in that order.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate that, both Moose and Ponch. It's been an honor to be on here, and thank you guys for what you're doing about, bringing a great airman's philosophy to, an incredibly large audience. I'll tell you, just in the last, I think you've done 4, and I was listening to your last one on Mission Command. I learned a ton about Boyd. I just learned a ton about everything. So thanks for what you're doing.
And thank you for your service. Really appreciate everything you've done for our country. So thank you.
All right. Awesome. You guys keep going strong. And again, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks again, Tank.